Hi there. So I'm taking a little break from the music and the Special Forces books to review a book I've read very recently, Command and Control by Eric Schlosser. And it's simply one of the most terrifying books I've ever read, because it shows just how close we came to nuclear catastrophe over the decades since nuclear weapons were first developed. And having lived through quite a lot of it, we all remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis, but as the book shows, that was by no means the worst or most critical time. So the catalogue of accidents and mistakes that were made over those years is absolutely jaw-dropping. So the book has two intertwined threads. Firstly, in 1980 there was an accident at a Titan missile silo, and it was caused by a technician dropping a screwdriver. Dropping a screwdriver could have caused an absolutely devastating catastrophe. And how this was handled both by the United States Air Force and by surrounding authorities, the sheriff and the local municipality, etc., is highly detailed and is absolutely mesmerizing. And the second part of the book, or around that, is the history of the development and the command and control of nuclear weapons. So the accident happened at a silo at a place called Damascus near Little Rock. And I was talking about this book to a friend of mine who's fairly young. And anyone who was born after the fall of the Berlin Wall has no memory of this kind of thing. And it was as if I was talking science fiction, telling him that around this small city in America, there were 18 missile silos, and this was just one unit. They were spread all over the United States, mainly in more isolated areas. And the Titan was a 9-story high missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, and they were buried in these silos, which were amazing feats of construction. How they built them and serviced them is absolutely an industrial feat. The blast doors on top weigh 740 tons, so it's an amazingly complex thing. And I was telling this friend of mine about it. I could see it didn't resonate with anything in his experience at all. Obviously the Soviets had similar setups, and they were all poised to attack each other. And the missile silo system was such that the control was down to 2 officers who sat in a control room. They had rotating shifts, and entry and exit procedures were rigorous and security tested. However, the book does disclose a time when one of the guys, just to try as a prank, managed to defeat the nuclear security using a credit card. And these 2 guys were in the silo, in the control room, and they each had a control desk, and they were separated so that you couldn't touch each other's control desks. Each guy was armed with a sidearm in case the other guy went berserk. And if they had the launch command, each would have to turn his key within a set period of time, and it was impossible to reach the 2 keys together. And this was the system. anyway, as I said, there was this accident, and one of the problems was the Titan missile had a tremendously volatile fuel, and you know that was, I don't know how wise it is to put a nuclear device on top of highly inflammable / explosive chemicals, but that's the system. So anyway, as I said, the other part of the book goes into the development of the nuclear weapons, and obviously it was highly secret. One of the biggest and most secret projects ever, the Manhattan Project. And the first test, which was codenamed Trinity, out in the Nevada desert, one of the scientists, Edward Teller, he was worried that the explosion would ignite the atmosphere and kill everyone. So here you have an eminent scientist, and his view was that it could have been a catastrophic device. His fellow scientists took the opposing view, and they want, in the event, obviously the world didn't end. But what it shows, as Richard Bandler once said, you know, on one hand you've got a pretty good bomb, and on the other hand you're going to wipe out the planet, and you go ahead and develop the bomb. That is kind of what makes me wary of scientists, and in all scientists being on television and in the news all the time recently with the Chinese virus, and I always have that at the back of my mind, that scientists are not necessarily the most stable people. So originally control of atomic weapons was in the hands of the Atomic Energy Commission, and they had rigorous controls, and they separated the core, etc., and only handed over to the military under certain conditions. This was eroded. The military started demanding, and quite rightly in their view, from their perspective, their job was to defend the United States, and they needed to have the weapons dispersed and ready to go, fearing that the Soviets would be attacking in a very short order. And gradually the Air Force and later the Navy took over command and control of these weapons. Unfortunately, the history of aviation accidents shows us that the human factor in any kind of system is never 100%. It's never fallible. We get distracted, we forget checklists, and checklists were devised because we get distracted and forget things. But even then, they skip pages, and all sorts of things can happen. And no matter how many safety devices you build in, you always have the human factor. And the book goes on to illustrate this in fantastic detail. So a B-47 jet bomber crashed in Morocco, and there was a fire. It had a nuclear bomb on board, and it was all covered up. It didn't detonate, but there was a dispersal of plutonium in the area. But then, if that wasn't bad enough, a month later, another B-47 is flying from Savannah, Georgia, actually coming over to England, to the UK. And while it was still over Georgia, they had a warning light in the cockpit that a pin in the arming system wasn't fully seated. So the pilot in command sends the navigator into the bomb bay, this non-pressurized bomb bay. He couldn't enter wearing his parachute, so he goes into the bomb bay. He's actually standing on the bomb, a Mark 36 nuclear, Mark 6 nuclear device, and he spends quite a bit of time trying to insert this pin and locate where it should go, and he's fiddling around. And as the bomber moves, he loses his footing and he grabs for something to hold on to, which happens to be the lever, which is the manual release, and the bomb bay doors open and bomb drops. He manages to grab something and hold on and not be killed, but the bomb does drop. But fortunately, it doesn't explode because this pin hadn't been fully inserted. And that was just one of many, many times where bombs have been dropped. When the Strategic Air Command started working out how to defend against a Russian attack or Soviet attack, one of the things they did was have an alert cycle where aircraft were permanently in the air. All the time there would be a number of, whether they were 47s or later B-52s, flying. And they used to fly these big oval patterns. But they used to fly for so long that they had to be refueled numerous times. Now, air-to-air refueling is a very, very dangerous process. So you've got two multi-engine jets mating at altitude, and inevitably things go wrong, and there have been several crashes of the nuclear bombers as a result of having to refuel. And the different aircraft that they developed for this were really amazing. I visited the US Air Force museum at Wright-Patterson in Ohio when I was down there at Dayton doing some courses, and it's a fantastic place. And one of the things they had the B-29 that had dropped the second atomic bomb, the one on Nagasaki. They had that there, but they also had the B-36, and I thought this was a most amazing aircraft, and it was the strategic penetrator for the nuclear fleet. It had 10 engines. It had 6 propeller-driven engines and 4 jet engines. And you can stand looking up in the bomb bay of this, and it's one of the most complicated pieces of equipment I've ever seen. And I also remember seeing them flying over our school during the Korean War, and a fairly low altitude. I think they were going into Burtonwood, and the number of engines on it was amazing. I didn't know it was a B-36 at the time, but later on I realised that's what it was. So another thing that the book mentions, and to me this was most frightening, from President Eisenhower onwards, 3 presidents in succession were advised by their most senior military advisors to take out a first strike attack on the Soviet Union. And obviously each of those presidents declined to do so, but that was the advice they were being given. Attack them now, Mr. President. We must go now. Otherwise it'd be too late and they're going to wipe us out. And this was the advice the presidents were faced with. Now, in the light of the current situation in Ukraine, with the Russian dictatorship threatening nuclear weapons on NATO, it's a very sobering reflection. Another thing that Eric Schlosser brings up is the proliferation of drugs in the United States military. And during Vietnam, this was well known. Troops were over in Vietnam absolutely spaced out. It was a conscript army, but it proliferated everywhere, and even inside the nuclear silos, the missile site, they found various kind of drugs, soft and hard drugs. So I mean, that was a terrifying thing to have to consider as well. Another factor is a couple of false attack alarms. The early warning system picked up what was interpreted as a Russian first strike, Soviet first strike coming over the horizon. In fact, it was the moon. Then another time, it was pretty authentic attack coming in. Luckily, they didn't send a counterforce, and it turned out somebody had put a training tape into the machine, and it was an exercise simulation that they were watching. So, looking back over those times, and of course, we still have nuclear weapons deployed in various places. It does seem very strange that the world was like that then, the Cold War and the weaponry we had and the architecture of it. I was working at a royal residence, and on a day off I had, it was a mile to a place called Warren Row. And I'd read about this over the years, since the 60s, this place. And it was RSG 6, Regional Seat of Government number 6, where the government would disperse to ride out a nuclear attack. And I went and had a look at this place. It was still functioning back then. This was in the 80s. And also on the Autobahn, Helmstedt, just after the wall came down, but not too long after, we were going to Berlin, and you went past the massive structures that the East Germans had to search vehicles and to control entry, and it was being obviously disused now. It's just you zoom past it on the Autobahn, and these relics serve to show us just what the world was like back then. But we also always face new problems, and the human failures and the human factors that make this book so interesting are still present. You know, if you're tinkering around with nuclear material, or if you're working in a lab in Wuhan, the human factor is always going to be the bugbear. And the book is amazing. It's one of, I think, the scariest book I've ever read, particularly since it's all true. And I think everyone should read it, really do.